today it's my great pleasure to introduce Brian Nolan, who is a professor at social policy at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford. Many of you will know. He there also leads the Inequality and Prosperity Research Program at the Oxford Market School. Most of you will be familiar with Brian as an authority in the broad field of inequality research. Recent work includes books such as Inequality and Inclusive Growth in Rich Countries, or Children of Austerity, the Impact of the Great Recession on Child Poverty in Rich Countries. And there are various other highly impactful and important papers that he's published in basically all of the disciplines that are subsumed in social policy. There are papers in the big journals in political science, in sociology, in economics. I'm not sure I'm forgetting some other outlets in other areas. Today, Brian will present work on intergenerational poverty in Europe. I'm proud to point out one of our former PhD students.
Yes.
Before I yield the floor, I want to remind all of you that Brian is also an organ professor.
So behave well.
So be nice.
Forgotten that.
Nice. Well, yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and thanks for the invitation. Appreciate it. Always nice to be back in these ever-changing hallowed halls. It wasn't like this when I was here originally more years ago than I care to remember or think back to. What I want to try and talk about today is essentially revisiting something that I worked on some time ago, and happily revisiting it with the two co-authors who you see mentioned here and who I hope are both online, because I'll be relying on them when it comes to the Q&A. So Michele Bavaro and Rafa Carranza, who many of you will know as he did his doctorate here before coming to work. He is now settling back in Chile. So as I say, they've done the heavy lifting, and I will be calling on them as required when we get to it. I'm very happy to be able to present these results, which as you'll see are sort of, I'm not exactly sure I label them as preliminary, but they're tentative, and we're very open to hearing what you think of what we've done, and in particular your suggestions for how we can do better. So this is just the outline of what I'm going to try and cover, and I'll be watching the clock to leave plenty of time for discussion. I'll briefly run through the background and context, not spending nearly as long on that as I would like to or could, before we get into grips with what we actually do. And I want to spend some time setting out for you the nature of the data that we have available, because in a sense, the key challenge is how to make the most of these rather unusual data with many weaknesses and limitations, but the great strength that they've been gathered in a harmonized way for 30 European countries. So what we want to try and do with these data is capture empirically the extent of childhood poverty in the previous generation and the relationship between your poverty status growing up and your current household's poverty. We sort of hook this around the notion of the Great Gatsby Curve, whether there's a Great Gatsby Curve for poverty as opposed for income, for across the income distribution more generally. I'll talk about that, but it's more a hook than something that we're totally sort of obsessed with or preoccupied with. And then I'll talk about some extra things we've done and where we're going to go with the research before we hear your guidance and suggestions. So what started us down this road was the realization that while there's an enormous literature, of course, about the relationship between your circumstances growing up and your outcomes in adulthood, there's a baffling profusion of studies trying to relate specific aspects of your circumstances in childhood and as a teenager, and a range of adult outcomes, and an enormous interest in the mechanisms that are underpinning these relationships, and enormous effort to try and pin down these more robustly or causally. There haven't been many studies, there have been some, assessing the impact of these specific features of your childhood circumstances with your poverty status at different points in your adult life. And there have been very few studies that actually try and link very specifically poverty in childhood with poverty in adulthood. The studies that have been done with that very specific focus have mostly been for individual countries, drawing naturally enough on longitudinal data on earnings or incomes. Very largely survey data, to some extent administrative data. Now these studies were reviewed by Stephen with his co-author Thomas Seidler back in 2007. And I ended up doing what largely amounted to an update of that very recently for a handbook that's going to come out soon. The handbook is about intergenerational relationships and persistence more generally, and the bit I got to do was the one on poverty. And what that brought out is how little we know, in fact, about the very specific question of the relationship between poverty in the parental household or when you're growing up and your chances of being in poverty in adulthood or now, if you like. And just to make the point that you might think, well, poverty is just the bottom of the income distribution. Can't we read off from the literature about income mobility more generally? Can't we read off conclusions for the bottom of the distribution? And while we can to an extent, it's very much more difficult and unrobust to read off conclusions about poverty. Many of so we can learn from studies, for example, the comparative study that Marcus Yankee was lead author on some years ago. We can see that mobility out of the bottom of the income distribution is probably relatively low in the US compared to the limited number of European countries that data for. But it's extremely difficult to read off a conclusion that applies specifically to poverty. Now, you may conclude by the time I've stopped speaking that this obsession with the notion and concept of poverty is itself misguided. I'm open to having that conversation, but for the purposes of this exercise, what we're focused on is trying to capture not just the bottom of the income distribution, but poverty. And many of these comparative studies of income mobility, they mightn't relate even to household income in the first place. They mightn't take household composition into account by equalization. And even if they do, or where they do, knowing mobility out of the bottom 20% in country A and country B doesn't allow you to read off a conclusion about poverty if poverty is 10% in one country and 30% in the other. So just to make a point we can go back to again, but to make the point that a surprisingly limited number of studies and amount of sort of substantive findings relate very specifically to the poverty in the parental household or in childhood, call it for short, and poverty in adulthood or now for short. One very interesting study that tries to do exactly this very recently is Zach Parlin and co-authors have brought together panel data for 5 countries, and they've worked very hard to try and harmonize these in terms of the income concept and the way poverty is being measured one of the other problems with trying to bring together national studies is that they measure poverty in a variety of different ways, using different thresholds and so on. So this study tries to harmonize that and make a legitimate, if you like, robust comparison across these 5 countries on the basis of income, which is, of course, not the only thing that you might like to know if you're measuring poverty, but it's generally a central element of measuring poverty. So they come up with some interesting conclusions about poverty persistence. In other words, the impact of poverty back then when you were growing up on your risk of poverty currently or in the last 5 years. That poverty persistence in that sense is much stronger in the USA than in the other countries they covered, and also stronger with some considerable variation across the other 4 countries as well. And they use these data to analyze a variety of different decompositions and intermediation analysis of the sort that I'll talk about a bit myself. So we don't have income data in what we're doing. What we do have is information from the what get called the ad hoc intergenerational modules that are attached to or included with the EU-SILC data gathering exercise or enterprise framework that provides the core social indicators for the European Union going back to 2005. So the standard component of SILC is the basis for producing indicators of current poverty and targets that I'll talk about in that regard, but with a very specific objective of capturing intergenerational relationships to do with poverty and deprivation. These special modules were included in 2005, 2011, and more recently in 2019. So everything we do is based on the 2019 ad hoc intergenerational module. So what does that provide you with? Well, crucially, it provides you with data for 30 countries. And that's if you like, that's the unique strength. On the other hand, the price you pay will be obvious when I set out for you the data that it provides you with. Various people, including myself and co-authors, worked with the earlier 2005 and 2011 modules. These were very instructive. Suffered from serious missing data problem about various aspects of the parental household that I can talk about a bit. Missing data is still an issue with the 2019 module, but is much less of an issue than it was with the earlier ones. So we've got 30 countries, EU member states plus those 3 there. And alas, unlike the previous modules, guess what? The UK is not. So there has been some research using those earlier modules on not exactly the topic that we're going to tackle, but on related issues. With Chris Whelan, I did a paper that looked at the relationship between a couple of indicators of childhood circumstances and outcomes measuring current poverty in various ways. And there's a couple of other studies that I will let you read there that do a similar thing. So they're relating the individual indicators that are available for the parental household to either measures of poverty or measures of related circumstances in adulthood. But they're not trying to measure poverty to poverty persistence. Let me just say briefly how we're going to measure poverty in the current generation for the respondents. So EU-SILC has a profusion of information, various ways. As you'll know, there's a large literature trying to measure poverty in various ways using this information for households currently, using income and a variety of other non-monetary pieces of information. What we do, for reasons that will become obvious when I talk about the parental data, is we're going to use two measures that we label for the purpose of presentation, a narrow and a broad measure of current poverty. And these are very standard in that the narrow measure is the straightforward and most widely used income-based measure of poverty. Your household is in poverty if it's below 60% of the national median equivalent household income at the time. With this measure, 14% of the respondents for whom we have information in the intergenerational module count as currently poor. As a robustness check, we included a measure of poverty that's a bit broader, which actually is what the EU target as their in framing their high level poverty target for 2030, and that's you're either under the income poverty threshold or you're registering severe material deprivation in terms of a range of deprivation indicators, non-monetary indicators, or you're in a household where there are working age adults and hardly anyone is doing much paid work. That's not the technical definition of people do. So it's a bit of this high level poverty target is a bit of a muddle, if you like, or a bit of adding apples and oranges, but it enables us as a robustness check to come up with a poverty measure that's very widely used and that captures 19% of the sample as currently being poor in this broad sense. Now, crucially, what do we know about the childhood household economic circumstances? So the way it's framed in the module is that the respondents, who are all adults of working age, so it doesn't cover those who are at retirement age. So adults of working age, each individual adult, for the most part, is asked about the circumstances of their household when they were about 14. Now, you can say, well, actually, childhood poverty, we know its impacts are most severe when the poverty is in the very early years. But for practicality, the assumption is that, crudely, the respondent is much more likely to know something about the household when they were 14 than when they were 2. So they're asked a battery of questions about their parents and their parents' circumstances. And the crucial pieces of information that I'm going to dwell on and make use of is they're asked, first of all, about a set of 3, what we're going to call deprivation indicators. So they're asked whether the household, back when they were 14, was able to meet these needs. And if they say they weren't, they're asked, is that due to financial constraints or some other reason? That's first a crucial piece of information. They're then asked about the financial circumstances of the household at the time, and they're asked to label them on a 6-point scale going from very bad to very good. Now we can talk at length about what frame of reference the respondent is likely to use when they're assessing this. But that's the question, and that's the information that we're going to be able to make use of. They're asked about the education of each parent, just with three levels distinguished. And they're asked about the activity status of each parent, again, when the respondent was about 14. So we make use of this. So that's pretty much the sum of information available that we can draw on. So what do we do, and how do we try and come up with a poverty measure for that? So we use the occupational and activity information to come up with a social class categorization that I can return to if needed. But I won't dwell on it. But essentially, we have 4 indicators or 4 dimensions of to capture childhood economic circumstances. We're going to count that childhood household as deprived if it's deprived of any of those 3 deprivation indicators that I mentioned, And that deprivation or that lack is attributed to financial constraints by the respondent. We're going to count them as experiencing financial hardship if the response on that question is one of the three responses, including bad, rather than three including good. We're going to count them as low educated if neither of the parents has an education level above what's counted here as low education, which is less than upper secondary. I'm going to count the household as working class if neither of the parents fits in a category above the ones I've mentioned here. So they're the four binary indicators that we now have for these dimensions. So I'm going to show you what each of these individually looks like, just to give you a sense of the variation. And so in terms of the deprivation indicator, you're going from essentially the countries with the highest level of reported childhood deprivation would have about 40% registering as deprived, down to about 15 or 10% in the least. Less variation, except for the outlier at the bottom, for financial circumstances or hardship. A great deal of variation in the prevalence of low education. Thank you. And a very substantial proportion in most countries registering as working class, although you'll notice at the top that this isn't the case in Switzerland, where there's clearly something wrong. So we're going to come up with two parallel measures, a narrow and a broad one, of parental poverty to set off against our narrow and broad measures of current poverty. In framing a narrow measure, we're going to count you as parentally poor if you're reporting both that the household experienced deprivation and that it was in bad financial circumstances. So it's each of those with no reference to education or social class. That's the narrow measure. And that gives you about 16% of respondents showing as being in a poor household growing up. And then, again, to parallel our current poverty measure, we come up with a broad measure where you have reported either deprivation or financial hardship, and you also are from a household where both parents were low educated and working class. This again comes up with a slightly larger number, 21%, and we're going to use that as our broad measure to see, crudely speaking, whether the measures of poverty persistence we come up with look pretty similar for the narrow and the broad. You're taking some reassurance from it. Now, what this graphic tries to capture is, for the narrow poverty measures, the relationship between the rate of current poverty against the standard income threshold and the rate of parental poverty measured by the two indicators I mentioned. So the line through the middle shows the predicted relationship that you get from these in terms of what, crudely speaking, I guess, what parental poverty you would expect based on the current level of poverty. Now, does this look as we might expect? Well, what's striking is that down here, there's a bunch of households, or rather a bunch of countries, where parental poverty looks lower than you would expect given current poverty. And actually, poverty in the parental household is in these countries lower than poverty is currently. So those are countries, Scandinavian countries for the most part, where what's driving this is that the reported levels of deprivation in the parental household are particularly low. So for those three deprivation indicators, the reports are much lower than in other countries, and in fact lead you to a poverty rate for the parental household that is lower than in the households of the respondents currently. There's a couple of other countries where that's not, particularly Bulgaria and Italy, where the same is true. The parental poverty rate looks low relative to the current one, but that's mostly not because of the deprivation reports, but because of the financial hardship reports. In other words, respondents in those countries are less likely to say financial circumstances were bad when they were growing up than they are elsewhere. So that's what's driving. That's what's driving these patterns. Now, you might say, well, what would we actually expect to see, and how does this align or conform with what we might expect? And that's not an easy question to answer, but it's when we look at that. But let's just focus on the robustness. Do the results that we get with the broad poverty measure as a check, do they look pretty similar to the ones with the narrow poverty measures? And they are, I think you probably would say, broadly similar. There are differences, but the most striking thing is these countries here. So Hungary, Portugal, and Spain, where the parental poverty rate is now very substantially higher than one would predict given the current poverty rate. And that's very, very much to do with the high levels in those countries of deprivation combined with low education and high prevalence of working class. In those countries, most households in the parental generation are reported to be low educated and working class. So when you combine that with the hardship measure, that's why you see such a high poverty rate. So,
Sorry.
yes.
Right, just a clarifying question.
Sure.
So what would be the years for Spain, I'm thinking,
Yeah,
that would cover, so 14, when the respondent was 14, so
Yeah.
so that is equivalent to the 70s, saying he's in there.
well, so it varies. The respondents are aged between 25 and
50 something,
Yeah,
yeah,
55, I think it is. So it's
Okay.
that gives you covers
Yeah,
quite
minus
a-
14, I'm trying to
Yeah,
work it out in
covers
my
quite
head,
a-
but I'll follow up. Sorry.
90s and 2000s.
Yes.
And so we do, I mean, one of the things we do that I wanted to talk about is we look within age categories to try exactly to pin down when the parental, when that age 14 was within a tighter window, because here you're looking at a really time.
Sorry, another quick clarification. So just to understand these numbers, they are for the subsample of individuals that were asked this question, because these are different from the,
Exactly.
okay. And if there's two individuals in the same household that answered, this is you aggregate at the household level, don't you?
No, because they came from different households, so we're equally interested in each of their backgrounds.
Okay.
So that the unit is very much the individual.
This is incest. They had different parents.
Well, I mean, in some countries it might not be that.
They just look
If we live in the same
sister.
household that I've been in at 14 when I'm 25, right? I mean, Spain, for example, that might be quite common. So there might be multiple individuals that have answered the question for the same. But
Yes, there could be, say, between 25 and 30.
Yes.
Yeah, for the most part, yeah.
and then how do you make use of that information? If you aggregate at the household level, they might be reporting different things, no? For example, for the subjective financial hardship. Of the two siblings.
Different time periods, they might be reporting different things.
Yeah.
Could be
Why is that a
twins.
problem?
Yeah.
Well, if one says we're very badly off and the other one says we weren't so badly off, then I'm not sure if it's a deprivation or that household that is.
But that might be experiencing that at a different childhood period, right?
I mean, the number of siblings who we would be capturing still in the parental household. Or indeed the number of siblings
Yeah, I mean,
living
anyway,
together
that's more.
would be very limited.
Yeah.
Not to shift these results. And I should have mentioned that there's one wrinkle that while for most countries, each adult is posed these battery of questions, in what are called our register countries, there's only one, because there's only one individual supplies the information for the household, and then all the other information is filled in from administrative data. So for Scandinavian countries, we only have one respondent per household. For the countries we have that. So what we want to do now is use this information about poverty in childhood and poverty now to assess the extent of persistence or the impact of childhood poverty on your risk of being currently poor, and crucially how that varies across countries, because that's what we're fundamentally interested in, seeing if we can capture that variation and try to understand it. But the first thing is to convince ourselves that we have robustly or reliably captured it. So what we do is we estimate a standard logistic regression model, and we derive two measures of persistence. One, the straightforward marginal effect, and the other, we calculate the odds ratios for the impact of childhood poverty on current poverty. I'll come back to the choice between them, but I'm going to present results primarily based on the marginal effect for reasons that. So this is the pattern of estimated marginal effects from these models, where the dependent variable is current poverty and the only predictor is childhood poverty, and the confidence intervals around them. So you can see first of all that there's really quite substantial variation across these countries. So that's interesting in and of itself. You can see that there is more persistence in Romania and Bulgaria, worse countries being covered than elsewhere. And you can see for many of the countries, these are ranked, obviously they're ranked by estimated marginal effect. For the countries towards the top, the confidence interval covers 0. So, and for many of these, if you're comparing pairs of countries, in many cases, the confidence intervals overlap. But we do obtain a ranking, and we do get a measure of the extent of variation in the persistence of poverty intergenerationally.
So Brian, can I just ask about magnitudes?
Yes.
So what you're showing here is going from 0 to 1.
Yeah.
According to the narrow parental measure, and the horizontal axis is showing the percentage point change in the probability of being currently poor against a baseline of whatever it was, 21% or something. So a number like 0.2.
Yeah.
That's 0.2 percentage point range going from 0 to 1.
That's the elasticity.
I'm trying to work out whether these are bigger numbers or
Yeah.
small numbers,
Yeah.
and what the metric is.
So in the odds ratios are the odds ratios go up to 3. So the equivalent odds ratio for Bulgaria is of the order of 3 or 3.5. So so that gives you a more straightforward quantification, if you like, of the impact of childhood poverty in increasing your risk.
Well, the marginal effects good actually, but
Yeah.
and I'll come back to that
Oh, yeah, that's-
later, but
yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
trying to work out this.
Yeah, so that's the coefficient in the logistic regression.
What? No, surely
No.
not. Surely not. Not for a marginal effect, we have to do some averaging, don't you? Across all the individuals in the sample.
Yeah, sorry, it's,
Yeah,
yes, yeah,
And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
based on the coefficient, obviously,
Yeah,
so it's the
exactly.
odds ratio.
So first robustness check is what do we see when we use our alternative broader poverty measures? And this is what you see. It's a broadly similar picture again. Similar ranking, more or less, with certainly in terms of the countries at the top and the bottom. Individual countries shift in their rank, in their position, ranked in terms of persistence, but generally not more than 2 or 3 places. So a certain amount of reassurance is to be derived, if you like, from the comparison between the narrow and the broad. It's a generally similar picture, but I wouldn't overstate the degree of alignment between them. So we thought it was important to undertake a battery of robustness checks, and I'm sure there's more we can do. One is to use alternative summary measures. And again, I think what I've just said about the narrow versus broad would apply there, that a generally similar picture, but not by no means identical picture, we derived when we use odds ratios rather than marginal effects. We then spent a lot of time playing around with different ways of using the parental household information. We, rather than doing what I described, we spent some time producing a single summary index with the 4 dimensions and equally weighted and using thresholds of 2 or 3. That gives you somewhat different results, because effectively you're giving more weight to the parental household being low educated or working class than we have done in our main analysis. And we were uneasy about doing that because our underlying understanding or belief is that the first 2 dimensions, the deprivation and hardship dimensions, are, with all their limitations, a more direct proxy or indication of childhood poverty than simply being low educated or working class or indeed both. But so we have results using that alternative way of capturing childhood poverty, and it certainly does. It makes a difference, but we played around with a sample in terms of how we treat immigrants. So to come to the Great Gatsby Curve idea, and whether this applies in the case of poverty, there's, as you know, an enormous literature now about this notion that intergenerational mobility is lower in situations where inequality is higher. There's a rather messy literature in terms of individual earnings, household income. There's a very big literature in terms of potential underlying mechanisms, and there's lots to be debated about including stuff that Stephen has thrown into the mix about the appropriate summary measure, population covered, what the timing should be in terms of what we're trying to measure. Is it income inequality in the parental generation, and when exactly, and so on. And indeed, whether it applies more to cross-country comparisons or change over time. And so there's lots of debate there, and we're not trying to contribute to that or make a strong claim that Great Gatsby Curve has been robustly established for example. What we are trying to do is just have a look at whether there's a Great Gatsby type relationship for poverty. Now, there's many reasons for thinking that there might be, because many of the mechanisms that are understood to underlie the Great Gatsby Curve generally also have applicability when thinking about poverty, and indeed it could be argued to operate even more powerfully when we're talking about coming from the bottom of the distribution rather than the middle or upper parts of the distribution. So I've listed off there just some of the very wide variety of mechanisms that could lead us to believe or expect that growing up in a poor household would increase your risk of poverty. And this is what we get with our narrow poverty measure when we map the estimated marginal effects against current poverty. And we get what I think would constitute a reasonably powerful relationship, summarized in a correlation coefficient of 0.6. Now, as in the income inequality Gatsby curve debate, you could argue that's all very well, but actually it's poverty in the parental generation that the relationship should apply to. So is persistence more pronounced in countries where poverty in the parental generation was higher rather than lower? And we now see a correlation that's considerably lower, but it's still not far short of 0.4. So that's with our narrow current poverty measure. What about with our broad? We see a rather similar relationship with the broad current poverty measure, showing an even stronger relationship than the narrow one, correlation coefficient of 0.68. But again, when you go to look at poverty in the parental generation, and the correlation is very substantially lower. So that in a way is probably the chart we would be pointing you towards. We wanted to assess whether this Gatsby relationship does exist. And you're then into, in some sense, is 0.35 a high number or a low number. So that would summarize what we see in terms of correlation with arguably the parental poverty correlations being the relevant ones. And just to make the point again in terms of robustness, is this what we see when we do the same exercise with odds ratios? What we see lower correlations all around, and now a correlation with parental poverty of the order of 2-4. So what might be going on? What might be underlying this? Well, the mechanisms that I mentioned earlier are all relevant, but one very straightforward potential contributor is that you might well expect that where poverty is higher, that the average poor person is further below the poverty threshold. So poverty gaps might be higher where poverty itself is higher. So it would be reasonable then to assume that the implications of being poor are going to be more serious where poverty itself is higher, because you're further, the depth of your poverty is more severe. So what I map here without identifying the countries is the relationship in terms of current poverty between the poverty rate in the country and the median poverty gap. And I was particularly anxious to show this because this comes from the EU's battery of social indicators, and this median poverty gap measure was suggested by John Hills, and I was particularly anxious to give that a mention and note how bad it is. So it is the case that poverty gaps are generally greater where poverty itself is higher. The differences are not huge, to use a technical term. If you split the sample in half on the basis of the current poverty rate, the average poverty gap for one half is of the order of 18%, and for the higher poverty half, it's of the order of 23-24%. So it's certainly the case that poverty gaps are greater. And that's, a contributing factor. Obviously, there's a lot more work. And that difference is not perhaps as great as one might anticipate. So I'm going to mostly leave it there, except to add that we've also used the data to do some mediation analysis, which is sort of a standard practice in other studies that are trying to capture intergenerational poverty relationships. Adding into the model things like the respondents' own education and their own occupational class, as well as other characteristics or features of the household, to see to what extent they seem to be the channels through which the intergenerational poverty effect is operating. These mediation variables account for a substantial proportion of the estimated effect. But what's interesting, and I won't have time to go through it, is that if you look at the variation across countries in the role of own education versus own social class, and the extent to which they jointly account for the estimated effect of childhood poverty. There's quite a lot of variation from across these countries in the role of education versus class. And that's something that we can probably develop, because there's a significant literature focused not specifically on poverty, but on the intermediation effects of these variables in terms of other outcomes. So let me just run through the conclusions then. So our starting point is that there's a lot we don't know about the cross-country variation in intergenerational poverty, specifically as a phenomenon and characteristic of interest. These data, we think, offer a unique basis for studying this, capturing this cross-country variation. We tried to bring out that analytical choices that you make along the way in terms of how you measure, in particular, parental circumstances, parental poverty, but also how you measure poverty currently. And there would be plenty of other options that you could use in terms of measuring current poverty, if you wanted to go down that road. That these things do make a difference to the results that you find, but that there's some degree of commonality. I suppose where we leave it is that if you go back, and I can, to the chart listing countries in terms of ordered, in terms of their effects, the strength of poverty persistence, they don't fall neatly into any of the sort of welfare state categories or geographical groupings and clusters, or at least they don't. There is some overlap, but they absolutely don't fit neatly into our standard social policy types of country clusters. So there's plenty of work to be done to try and explain this variation if we are happy to take it as established in the first place. And that's, I guess, the stage. Variety of different things we want to do. We can use this information about parental circumstances in a variety of different ways, including perhaps applying latent class analysis as one way of combining the 4 dimensions, or perhaps bringing further information into it. We can try and see if we can come up with structured patterns of country characteristics that underlie the variation that we're seeing here, and perhaps use the age cohorts that we can distinguish in the data to probe whether there are dramatic changes over time happening in specific countries. So that is where we have got to with it, and very much look forward to hearing your reactions and your suggestions.